And I'll get the hint. I'm going to start before 1919 because there's a small issue of a long war before the spring of 1919. The analysis that I want to go and present today is really located as an extension of something that I talked about the last time I came to talk in Bristol, which was the importance of economic aspects of that lie behind individual motivations for joining the army, and I want to draw attention today to some of the economic dimensions of what causes men to wish to leave the army. Why it's important is because it refocuses, it redefines the way in which people look at the First World War. That individual soldiers joined up partly because of individual hardship and also because of economic dislocation that occurs in 1914. And what I wish to advance today, in a way that's probably much more comprehensible to us in the era of Brexit, is the idea that great events or great changes in policy inevitably impact upon people's economic relationships and circumstances. Okay, let's start off with the war itself. The frame that I'm using today is going to be overwhelmingly patriarchal and a male frame. It's not because I'm deliberately ignoring the role of black troops and of minority ethnic groups in the British Army, people like the Chinese Labour Corps or the South African Labour contingents or the British West Indies regiments. I'm not. It's just simply that within the time frame I've got, with the locus being specifically on the British Army raised in Britain, then the criteria that's used to recruit soldiers, which is that they have to be of pure European descent, limits the way in which they feature. So there is another lecture at some point which I'd like to do looking at the non-white, non-Europeans in there. It's also limited in terms of gender as well. And on this I have to confess ignorance. It's not that there weren't women in the British Army, there were an awful lot. And if one includes auxiliary formations, then you're talking of hundreds of thousands. The difficulty is that the records of uniformed formations in the British Army relating to women's service are really very scanty indeed. I know of maybe 2 or 3 PhDs that have been completed on the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and even then it's really having to stretch stuff to find information. Also, when one comes to look at mutinies, the way in which women who were in service expressed their discontent or their dissent was pretty much the same as the men, but it was dealt with in very short order. In other words, there was no room for negotiation. Flag that word negotiation up, because I'll be returning to it later on. The terms of engagement in the British Army were very different to those of the Continental armies. The Continental armies is easy, conscription, right from the word go. But the British Army, it wasn't. Instead, what you got was a whole series of different terms of engagement. So, for example, the pre-war regular soldiers, mostly wiped out by the first Christmas of 1914, the regular army just about. 50% of the army that went to war in 1914 were army reservists, older soldiers who'd done their time but had been recalled to serve in the army. There were also territorial army men, the same territorials as we have nowadays, the Saturday night soldiers, yeah? So raised really for civil emergencies at home in much the same way as the US National Guard. So they were never really intended for overseas service, although many did go overseas during the Boer War. There are then the various colonial forces, and by those I'm referring to the white dominions here of Canada, of Australia, and of course of South Africa as well. And topped on to that, there's also a category known as the Derby men. And these are people who undertook to go on service in 1915 if called upon to do so with the National Register, named after Lord Derby, who came up with this thing. And then finally, the conscripts. Tacked on at the end, but statistically quite important, because by the end of the war, you have an army of 6 million, of whom half are conscripts. Right, so let's just go back through that. Each one of these groups of varying sizes, the biggest one of which will be the conscripts, have different terms of service. Some of them are duration of war only. I'd left those out actually. It was the Kitchener men. Yeah, they signed on for the duration of the war plus 6 months. Yes, that was the terms of service for the PALS battalions and so on. Right? But it's complicated. That's what I want to get over. Yeah? And each individual group went in on different arrangements, on different understandings of what their terms of service were going to be. During the war itself, you do have people mutinying. Not an awful lot. If one looks at the courts martial, it's almost laughably pathetic, given the millions of men that served, that you only have a few thousand actually, it's about 3,000 or so, that are tried and court-martialed for mutiny. And most of those just get a spell of jail or a punishment, but it's nothing catastrophic. Only 3 are executed after a court-martial. You know, they were actually tried by court-martial for the offence of mutiny and executed. Of those, one was an Australian, Jack Braithwaite, who was executed in 1916, was a hopeless alcoholic. He'd spent half of his civil life drying out on an island off the coast of one of the New Zealand islands. A really hopeless case, who got involved in a fracas in one of the military prisons, and the controller of prisons in the field decided he wanted to make an example of one stroppy prisoner, and that was Jack Braithwaite. The second one of which is Jesse Short, famed because he's involved in the mutiny at Tapple Base, the one that's associated with the monocle mutineer. Forget Percy Topless, that was an invention of a Scottish fascist during the 1920s. That's where the core story of the monocle mutineer comes from. There's nothing whatsoever to do with Percy Topless, who wasn't even there. But Jesse Short he was a miner, originally from Wales, worked in his family, lived with his family in Felling, in County Durham. He happened to get absolutely, completely pie-eyed drunk, possibly because he found out that his wife had had an affair with another man while he'd been away, and she was pregnant. It was a little incident within the family that split the family to the present day. But he was seen in the company of men with red flags. The red flags had actually been pinched from the walls of the YMCA. They had red flags as decorations. They weren't an indication of socialism. But it was very unfortunate, you see, because it's September 1917, and the Russian Revolution was very much in the air. So the reference to the red flag saw him in very short order, charged in the evening, tried the following morning, and executed a couple of weeks later. No defence, no nothing. The last one, to which I want to refer, as an example of the 3 mutineers that were executed, was a man called Muhammad Ahmed, who wasn't even a soldier. He was an auxiliary labourer, one of the Egyptian labourers that were brought in, basically for step and fetch it stuff, unloading ships, shifting ammunition, doing the grunt work, which would free up fighting men to go and get engaged in combat. So here's the third category. He wasn't actually shot for mutiny, he was shot for attempting to mutiny. He had allegedly referred to his supervisor as a Christian dog, which was enough to get him shot. He's buried in Marseille. Those are the 3. Not much of an indication of mutiny, is it? It looks like the British Army never had a crisis during the First World War, at least certainly not during the duration of hostilities. That, of course, is all complete claptrap and hooey. It's just quite simply that officers don't want to report the fact that they can't control their men. So they have an interest in not reporting it as mutiny, but as a disturbance, an offence under section 40, which is behaviour that is likely to provoke disorder or disturbance, yes? It's a kind of catch-all category, but the M word for mutiny doesn't appear anyway. And the men themselves, if they have been involved in a collective disturbance of some sort, or a conspiracy, that would be enough, or failing to report a mutiny, or failing to do your utmost to suppress a mutiny, all of those, that enormous catch-all, are classed by the army as mutiny. Then nobody's going to own up to being a mutineer like, stuff the lot of you, I'm still defiant, I'm still a mutineer. Not with a potential death sentence you're on. And so mutiny kind of melts away. It looks like a very obedient, a very deferential army, you know, forelock tugging tummy, you know, or Bruce Bairnsfather's cheery old Tommy in the trenches puffing on his pipe, you know, old Bill, yeah. It's simply untrue. In fact, the British Army mutinied all the time. It wasn't called that, but it still happened. And there's 1,001 ways in which it gets expressed. A really simple one. A captain, an officer, gets a medal, and the men decide they don't actually think he really deserved it. It should have gone to the corporal, you know, for some act of gallantry. So on parade, when the medal is presented to the fellow, well done you, and everybody salutes, and the men are called to attention, the men from his unit are called to attention to present arms. You know, it's a sign of, yeah, you did it. Yeah? And they do it, one drops his rifle, the other does it very sloppily, the others do it really slowly. Everybody knows there what's going on. It's a calculated finger to him. Yeah? It's done deliberately. Nobody can actually get pinned down for something that looks like, oh, you're rather sloppy in coming to attention. There isn't a single person on that parade ground who doesn't know exactly what the men are doing. But you can't pin them for a particular offence. They've done, pardon me, nobody's confessed to conspiring together. So, with mutiny, what I'm saying is it's a very broad spectrum. The image that we have from the Indian Mutiny, or the patriotic uprising it's known nowadays, is that you instantly go out, there's a bit of rape and slaughter, kebab the officers, set light to a few things, and then terrify all the locals. That is the last thing a mutiny is. The only people who ever get shot in confrontations during the First World War, during hostilities, are black troops, or Chinese on occasion. They're the only ones, and that's simply because they are kept within closed camps, and any attempt to break out is treated as tantamount to attempting to escape. Now, that description I've given you is something that has a political dimension to it. In Britain, during 1917, to welcome the Russian Revolution, there were attempts to set up soldiers and workers' councils. Tunbridge Wells was one of the sites. There were other attempts in Cardiff. Oh, Tunbridge Wells is the hotbed of the revolution. It's a bit like Croydon, if you heard something this morning. The kind of way in which we see the world divided up in Britain into counties and so on doesn't work militarily. Military bases are in strange areas. So, for example, Cheltenham, within military intelligence, is far more important than Bristol. There are many people in Bristol who would want to argue about that. But in terms of military priorities, it's a very different kind of map that you see. We'll be looking at that in a little while. So that when you have a mutiny that breaks out in a place like Tunbridge Wells, a place where I might say of very little consequence except to Southerners, in practice actually it's crucially important. It's the main reserve for troops that are going to be sent out to France. It's a huge training area. You've got 2 or 3 regiments, each one sending in their battalions for training there. It's actually quite an important reserve training area. It's also within a spit's distance of London, and it's on the main roadway that goes down to Dover. Troops getting stroppy there could make an awful bit of mayhem there by simply seizing up communications, stopping trains, stopping people going around the road, that sort of thing. That's absolutely, a threat in military terms, if you want to look at where mutinies happen. You've also got, during the Second World War, attempts to radicalise the army, and you get odd people, and sometimes they really are very odd, who will leaflet the army, not necessarily with anti-war tracts, but drawing on the inspiration of the Russian Revolution to try and get some form of autonomous activism together. Sometimes they're socialists, sometimes it's groups that want to see improvement in the terms and conditions that soldiers are experiencing. And in 1917, the British Army got very, very exercised about this, particularly since it's in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And there was a gathering of intelligence officers which were called to a meeting and asked to identify the potential causes or potential threats for disorder. The sort of things that they picked up, however, were really rather strange. One would have thought overthrowing the capitalist system, perhaps, replacing Parliament, hanging the royal family or something like that. It wasn't at all. It was stuff like wanting more holidays, better quality food, getting decisions in industrial disputes settled quickly. They seem to be a bit too bureaucratic. The absence of sport and the lack of opportunity to gamble. They want a proper transport to and from work, for example. The growing fear that the dilution of labour by the introduction of women into munitions and engineering factories would actually mean that when you left the army, your job would have been taken by a woman. We're talking about the male soldiers. And every once in a while, the soldiers and workmen's councils, as they termed them. Not much was done about this, but the government decided to invest more power in what were called the competent military authorities. The competent military authority was an individual, a military individual, one of about 73 throughout the United Kingdom, who had military control over a particular area. Now, Roger, if you can go down to the last map that's, the last parade that's on there, you can see where it is. No, not that one. No, that's Bristol. Next one up. It's the one with the map of England on it. Spook map. Yeah, it's got a spook map, that's it. I don't suppose we can get a better focus. This is Britain from a satellite, many miles up in the sky, through a fog. I don't know. Well, okay. What you see here, is England and Ireland. There's another area for Wales. These big areas are actually the main military districts, Southern Command, Eastern Command, and so on. But within these, there are much smaller areas. They don't fit in quite with the county system. But each one of them are areas of military control. Why this is important, we'll see in a moment. But essentially, what you need to know is if there is any kind of emergency, if it's a civil emergency, people went to the local chief constable, yeah, using the constabulary. They, if there was any military involved at all, went to the competent military authority. What they were part of is a system of surveillance over the whole of the population. People who worked, for example, the vicar, the person who worked in the corner store, restaurant proprietor, or sometimes the local equivalent of neighbourhood watch, were voluntarily enlisted to provide reports in detail on all of the population. Those reports went to the competent military authorities. They were then collated and sent in to the War Office. So Britain, in that sense, was very much a police state during the First World War. It wasn't just a matter of chasing after conscientious objectives, but it does draw attention to the fact that maintaining any kind of a clandestine setup was almost impossible to sustain. That goes a long way to explain why, when mutinies occurred within Home Command, within the United Kingdom, you can't get really very much liaison. The CMAs also have spies within the ranks of the British Army. I know of two ones that I've come across. A guy called Fred Moss Dimmock, who was in the East Kents, and another one is a man called Raymond Gray, George Raymond Gray. The two of them are dressed in uniform, and they go from formation to formation. They establish a network of informers who report on what's going on in the ranks. It's inherently subversive of a military hierarchy. Yeah, they bypass generals and colonels and so on, and report only from within the army or to British intelligence. From them, we get some idea of how serious some of the mutinies were when we come to 1919. Okay, so the economics that I referred to earlier on, in terms of the imperatives for people joining the army, have another dimension to it as well. And that's to do with the women who went into munitions. The employment of women during the First World War, the mobilisation of women in the First World War, does increase the size of women in the industrial workforce. I think most of us, to be fairly conventionally anyway, think in terms of munitions workers working on producing shells, or the local poison gas factory down this way, and so on. There's a big debate about how that impacts upon the status of women in wartime British society. Some people argue it's not really all that much, it's 250,000 or so over and above what would have been the civilian workforce, but it's a changing configuration that women are working now on public transport, are delivering the post, are working in the gasworks, are working in engineering factories, and are much more visible as well. So there is a kind of an emancipatory element to it there. But if you wanted to kind of sum it up, borrowing from Gail Brabourne and Penny Summerfield's work, at the end of the war, those over 30 and with property got the vote, and most of the others got the boot. It's a crude way of expressing what is otherwise needs to be much more nuanced than that. but essentially the demobilisation arrangements for women were 2 weeks' wages, an entitlement over a very limited period of a few months to out-of-work pay at a much lower rate than the men got, and that was it. So you've got something like about, we're looking at March 1919, something in the order of 300,000, I think it is, claiming and being paid the money, but your entitlement's only for up to 3 months. So, end of the war, November, November the 11th, add on 3 months, and what you're looking into is the spring. The women aren't in the army and they're not mutinying, but the impact is upon the household income. If you take the women working in the factories contribute something towards their family or towards their household, once you take them out, you destabilise the household income. That means that the man who is in the army, being paid the proverbial shilling a day, actually it's much more than that by the end of the war, come under extreme pressure to try and get out of the army to better provide for their families. Capiche? Does that make sense? Yeah? So if you think about it in terms of family, and you're relying on, I don't know, the youngest of the family delivering newspapers. It's not much, but it's that makes you able to go and pay the rent as opposed to not quite paying the rent. Yeah? Now this is exacerbated by, firstly, a huge rise in the cost of living in 2 respects. One is the cost of food during the war, and the other one is the cost of rented housing. We don't even talk of home ownership in those days. That is the context in which the demobilisation programme is introduced in the spring of 1919. So we have a legacy of dissent within the war, but it's not big scale at all. You know, the numbers you talk a few hundred here and there. Economic imperatives, privation, and then a huge dislocation in terms of employment, of shifting from wartime production to the priorities of reconstruction, which is what Lloyd George pushes for during the December khaki election, and makes a series of extravagant promises. And one of those are, we'll be demobilising as fast as possible. But he didn't talk to the generals. He told them, because after all he is prime ministers, that there's going to be speedy demobilisation. Reasoning? That gets you votes. Yeah? Go back to Brexit, you'll see the same sort of process going on. He's a politician, damn it. The Minister for War, December the 10th, Lord Milner, resigned because what Lloyd George had done is that he completely wrecked the demobilisation programme. What had happened, you see, was back in 1917, planning for the end of the war, which they weren't sure when it was going to end, right, was to have a process of demobilisation which was geared to restore, to establish reconstruction at the end of the war. And what that involved was releasing coal miners to get the energy for the factories, yes? Releasing agricultural workers to make sure that there was food production picked up. Releasing people who would be pivotal to the reorganisation, the regeneration of what had been a war-driven economy to one that recognised the priorities of peace. This was all having to be accomplished at the same time as there weren't enough ships to go around. The Americans had commandeered all the ocean liners to shift their troops home, so there weren't any liners available to shift the Canadians, who were seen as being a bit lower down in terms of priority. So they parked the Canadians at Kimball Park in North Wales and told them to just go and sit there throughout the winter. The Australians were shifted out pretty quickly because they had a propensity for rioting and for attacking anybody who was black or Chinese. They are probably, I mean, there isn't a kind of scale for racism, I guess. There is. But they're much given to having pogroms. So at Surafend, they simply wiped out a Bedouin village on the pretext that they'd had something stolen from them. And when called to account by Lord Allenby, they counted him out. Counting out is Australian custom. You start with 10, 9, 8, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and when you get to 1, you go, out you Tommy Woodbine bastard, out. That was done to General Allenby, Commander-in-Chief in Egypt, on parade by the whole lot. It's a great anecdote. Australians trade in it all the time, but if you looked at the darker side of it, what you actually see here is an example of mutiny that demands some kind of a qualification for those people who for those people who just assume that mutiny is always going to be a positive finger up to authority, it is, but it comes at a price for some people. So we have these kind of things that are going on. So the Australians have shipped it out pretty damn quickly. The same went for the New Zealanders when they wrecked Whittledown Camp on Salisbury Plain. But I did say that it was going to be the Brits on which we'll be focusing. The Brits, the process was going to be by industrial categories. By Christmas, Lloyd George had promised that you'll get demobilisation. Oh, and those who weren't going to be demobilised immediately, you can go on leave for Christmas. So off they went, stuffed themselves with Christmas pudding or whatever was to hand for Christmas, had a rare old time. The Scots, of course, celebrated Hogmanay, and then all good things come to an end and you're expected to go back to northern France. Now, how do you feel about that? Yeah? You don't rejoice exactly, back to a cold barracks in one of the coldest winters that Europe had experienced, on a rickety railway system that's falling apart, to go and rejoin a bunch of people who had originally joined to fight a war, and now the war's over, don't want to fight it. It's not an enticing prospect. The army had introduced, however, a refinement. If you could get a letter from your employer, or your civilian employer, offering you a post, then you had to report back to France. I've got a job, sir. And they went, yeah, all right then, you can go. Now, nowadays, of course, you just get your cell phone, or an app, or whatever, you know? You just go, hey, I've got a job. Yeah. No, the army wants you to go all the way back to France. Not just France, perhaps southern Italy, or perhaps Egypt, or Salonika, no? To Greece, to report back and say, hey, look, I've got a job. Sometimes they would be offered the job by post, but that wasn't good enough. So the army had created this bureaucratic mess, and the bureaucratic mess was exacerbated by Lloyd George's promise. Expectations are very high, and quite simply, as the Leave men left London in their tens of thousands, moving down towards Dover and Folkestone, these were the ports we're going to get them over the Channel, there was a logjam. It was partly caused by a bit of bad weather out in the Channel, but the soldiers who were there, either those going back on leave, those that had tickets for jobs that they got open, and others who simply didn't want to go back, they'd done their time in the army, they felt that was it, the armistice has been signed, it's Christmas, hey, I'm staying. All together stopped. They marched on Folkestone Town Hall, they also marched in the ensuing days on Dover, not to negotiate with the army initially. They saw themselves as citizen soldiers. That's what Winston Churchill called them. So that's we're taking out his word. Winston Churchill, by the way, had just become Secretary of State for War. Milner having resigned. And that started the ball rolling. If one looks at that turbulent spring, January, you're looking at probably 50 or 60 incidents of mutiny. Folkestone and Dover are the best known ones because the numbers you're looking at are about 10,000 per day in Folkestone and probably another 10,000 at Dover. Those aren't my estimates, that's the estimates of the Chief of the General Staff. At first, they don't ask for a general to speak to. There are delegates elected in the same way that a trades union would elect their shop steward. By acclamation, by the mob as it were, they went to see the mayor. Yeah? In other words, what they're doing is subverting military authority and going to speak to the duly elected civil authority, which is a calculated way of sticking your finger up again to the army. The army itself went into panic mode. I don't have time to read out the long lumps of stuff that exist of what went on in Whitehall, but generals were blowing blood vessels, sending down the best and brightest of the youngest and sparkiest ones who arrived down there and conceded the demands. They gave way. They said, okay, fine. By the 28th of January, Churchill had issued instructions that a way of relieving the contradictions and tensions involved was to concede a basis of first in, first out. Meaning that those people who joined up at the beginning of the war were to be those that were given priority for release, which recognises wartime service, and also the older, and therefore married ones usually, were also to be taken into account. Now, it sounds like a slick solution, and it certainly didn't satisfy everybody, but it did meet the requirements of dozens and dozens and dozens of mutinies. The total number, and I'm borrowing here a bit from research that Roger's done, but also some of my own stuff, I'm looking at maybe 300,000 soldiers in one way and another, mutiny, not necessarily only for demobilisation. Often it was terms of service, a cut in the working week. You know, they wanted a 48-hour working week. Does that sound generous? The army doesn't have a 48-hour working week. You're there 24 hours a day, right? Getting Sundays off, like they would have if they were working in civilian enterprises. The tradition in those days was you work 5.5-day working week. So you work Saturday mornings, for example, you know? So they started to want parity with civilian terms of service. After all, if you're a skilled engineer in the army and you're a skilled engineer in civilian life, you want to have at least similar terms of service. And then there was a small matter of wages, because army pay then, and some would argue even now, is actually not really very good for what you're expected to do. Here I'm not talking about sticking bayonets in the enemy. What I'm talking about is maintaining railway lines, rolling stock, repairing lorry engines, catering, looking after the general servicing of barracks and so on. For every soldier that you have in the front line, there are at least 7 or 8 servicing that soldier, providing the support. In northern France, you have very, very few railway lines. It's again a legacy of the war, and I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but what happens is that those northern French ports running down from Dunkirk, Calais, Boulogne, down to Etaples, Le Havre, all of those ports on that, they call it nowadays the Opal Coast. The soldiers had other words for it, but it certainly didn't extend to jewellery. Those coastal resorts there, they all had huge camps based on them because they were the points at which supplies came over during the war. But they led into very, very few railway lines. Most of France was defended by the French army. The British actually only occupied a small littoral right up in the north, more or less Belgium and the Département du Nord over to Normandy. Yeah? That's basically the lines of communication. I'm simplifying this a bit, but not that much. Those areas came under enormous strain because instead of all traffic flow going one way, which was to feed the front as it were, now it had to cope with 2 ways, and the railway lines are literally falling apart. They had to cope with people being demobilised coming into the camps, and then supplies going out to the occupied areas of Germany, which was starving at the time, and also all the way down to Italy. So that railway system came under enormous strain, which meant that the railway workers servicing the engines, doing the repairs, the railway operating division, doing the repairs on the lines and so on, were being expected to work enormous amounts of hours, really long hours, to keep what was a ramshackle system operating. And they folded their arms and said, sorry folks, we want actually proper pay for that, and we actually want proper terms of service, otherwise we're not doing it. So in the railway yards at Val de Livière and at Audric, which is just outside Calais, what you got there was a group of skilled workers behaving in the same way as the old aristocracy of labour in the old engineering factories before the war, behaving exactly the same way, setting out their terms of service. They initiated negotiations which were not one whit different to the way in which the TUC would have negotiated agreements with the army, treating the generals down. The generals didn't know what to do. These skilled guys literally had them by the throat. If they fold their arms, they can't force them at bayonet point, and there's 1,001 ways in which somebody servicing a steam engine can make sure it doesn't move. So they actually conceded to them. But at the same time, in the huge base camps, which had previously been used for reinforcements, and which were now staging places for moving the demobilised soldiers back into the United Kingdom, you got log jams building up. People there of mixed groups. There was some would be coming through in one direction, others in another, and we still had the issue of who was to be demobilised first. Nobody, or at least some groups, didn't like the change in priorities because it meant all of a sudden they were being put back. Nobody consulted the conscripts about this, and they're half the army by then. They were dealt with in a very different way. They had no skills to bargain with. And so what happened to them was that the army simply moved in, well, it was a full brigade, but it was actually 2 divisions backing it up. So we're looking at about 20 or 30,000 men. Surrounded the camp and simply snatched the leaders. Now, there was a big fight over one particular fellow, a fellow called John Pantling, who had actually been arrested, court-martialed, and had been sentenced, I think he was sentenced to 2 years. General Haig wanted at least 2 of the ringleaders shot. But he was told by Lloyd George that actually the death sentence had been suspended for everything other than murder and mutiny, and I think it was seducing the king's consort or something. There was a third funny offence. But and he was told he wasn't allowed to shoot them, which was really rather upsetting for General Hayes, since he'd been quite accustomed to shooting people. Churchill told him, it's not on, you can't shoot anybody, which caused further fractures within Parliament. How Panting was dealt with was that the soldiers held up, insisted that Panting be retried by court-martial, by another court-martial, the offence against him to be rescinded, and he was to be released forthwith. And it happened. However, the army giveth and the army taketh away. The troops then surrounded the camp and literally at gunpoint broke up the leave camps. Now, you might say to yourself, well, this is a bit rum, isn't it? We've got one town, Calais, or at least Calais and environs. You've got 2 mutinies, one of which works and the other one doesn't. Right? The one that works is not a mutiny. You could be fooled for saying that, oh, well, it sounds like a damn mutiny to me, however many spots it's got on it. The other one conforms very much more to our idea of a mutiny being settled by threat or by force of arms. In practice, what happens is, it's always a mixture of the two. So, for example, if you have a camp that's fairly segregated in an area that's not near to a centre of civilian population, then you put in the heavy guns. So at Borden on Salisbury Plain, about March of 1919, the Royal Garrison Artillery men there wanted to have a relaxation in terms of their service, in terms of not just hours of work, but also of conditions in the camp. That was simply surrounded by 3,000 troops, armed with machine guns and everything else, and it was settled by threat of force. Other areas, however, it's much more nuanced. Sorry, I'll just mention in passing, the only other one which I think really does stand out in the United Kingdom is the Kinmel Park Mutiny, which happens in North Wales on March the 5th of 1919, and that ends with bloodshed. It's extremely, extremely rare, but you've got 5 soldiers who were shot, and about 40 or so who were wounded and injured, and followed by, I can't remember now, 70 or 80 courts-martial. That gets trammelled up very quickly for all sorts of reasons that have to do with Canada, not the UK. So I shall segue into 2 other reference points. Although the mutinies in the United Kingdom were, at the time, crucial, because they are actually at the points, the nodal points, where soldiers are being moved either by water or by rail transport, the ones that occurred overseas were, in many respects, even more serious. In Egypt, at Kantara Base, around Easter of 1919, soldiers who were expecting to be demobilised but were being held back there because the issue, once you've decided on first in, first out, that's one thing, but then you've got looking at 1 million, 1.25 million soldiers to move within the space of the summer. Okay, it takes a lot of moving, you've not got enough ships, so that means an awful lot of people hanging around in camps, drumming their fingers and tapping their toes, being stuck there, and that's what had happened at Kantara. Kantara is where soldiers who weren't necessarily A1 top-grade soldiers, but were considered fit enough to fight the Turks, were parked, along with soldiers from the Australians, from the Indian Army, very many of those were stationed there as well, at a time when the local population decided that they'd been humiliated enough by the British and launched a nationalist uprising, the Zaghlulist uprising. You don't read much about this, but although Egypt does not belong to Britain, it was one of those kind of rather strange states that had previously been really rather more under the French than anything else. It had effectively become controlled by the British. The British Army had to stay there because it needed control over what was to be the jugular line to India, and India is the jewel in the crown. The troops in Kantara Base organised, and they had a series of disputes, very much along the same lines as I mentioned to do with Calais. They had the absolute delight of huge meetings. The committee that organised, or the man who organised the committee, was actually a signaller. I could never understand how it was that this mutiny, which happens at Kantara, halfway down the Suez Canal, the most godforsaken spot you could ever want to find, there is sand, and maybe in the distance the odd pyramid, but that's all you've got. suddenly managed to extend all the way up to Haifa and right across to Alexandria with a committee of 24, of which there are 3 Bristolians represented, completely disproportionate in my opinion, but still 3. I'll give you the names in a bit. They managed to organise. How did they do that? You know, I mean, the Calais lot at least were within shouting distance of one another. The ones at Shoreham and at Dover, you have a concentration of people. So you have some form of communication. There's no loudspeaker or no loud voice like mine. But what happens is you get several dozen speakers all going through the same points with a crowd of literally thousands. So how did they do that? The answer was a man called Rabley. Louis Rabley was a telegraphist. He had family just outside Southampton. Found a member of the Labour Club in Southampton, member of the Clarion Cycling Club. Also a enthusiastic spiritualist as well. He belonged to the kind of Owenite tradition of British socialism rather than the Marxist one. Rabley was an amazing man. Headquarters telegraph. What he did was to use what's called sometimes chatter. When you're testing one of those kind of Morse code signal lines, you'll often communicate to say, is this signal okay? Then you send the message, yeah? He used chatter. And the reason why it got to be such a huge area that mutinied simultaneously was because he was actually using the headquarters signal lines simultaneously. He was an untouchable. Nothing happened to him. He came home and he died of flu a few months later. But the reason why, Distinguished Conduct Medal. He was an old soldier. He was, in every term, the perfect soldier. He was also the head of the committee that organised it all. He took the experience he'd had of working in trades unions, of organising in terms of socialist principles as the basis for organising the mutiny. And it won. Allenby sent a telegram back to London saying, there's too many of them, I can't charge them all with mutiny. The last one I'm going to refer to is, very, very briefly, occurs in India. It's going to be brief because I've written about it and it's been posted online. There's a website called Revolutionary History. In that one, it's a guy who was a blacksmith from the West Country, from Tiverton way. His name is Ernest Bowker. He goes down in history as nobody at all. I know less about him than I know about Louis Rabley. He is sent out to Mesopotamia, which again is one of the more godforsaken spots, theatres of war in the British Army at the time. The people who had their health wrecked there were shifted back to India for convalescence. And he was one of those who was transferred when Mahatma Gandhi started his first big disobedience campaign in 1919. The British mobilised every soldier there was. There's a core group of about 63,000 soldiers hold India. Lord knows how many million people. Lord knows how many Indian soldiers and princely states and so on. But the core group is 63,000. Most of them were burnt out territorials, many from this end of the world, from the West Country, from Wales, stuck out there. You'll see occasionally in old newspapers, letters of complaint. I'm stuck out here, they're giving us chapatis. I've seen the guy making the chapatis. He puts the dough under his armpit and wiggles it around. No, it's not true. But that's what they wrote in the letters. You know? All sorts of stuff like that. What Bowker did was extraordinary. He actually organised not just the mutiny at Deolali in Bombay, he also took his delegation all the way up to Shimla in the Himalayan foothills to meet the commander-in-chief. And if you go online, have a look at the mutiny in India, to put in my name and put in India Mutiny 1919, you can read about the exchange because I found the verbatim copy, word for word, of what was said. And what you have is a former blacksmith, an old grunt in the army that had been around for donkey's years, arguing with a sophistication that's as good as any negotiator you'll ever come across. Not bad going. A corporal up against a full-blown general. 2 days negotiations, and the shipment home began. What they objected to was that, as they termed them, the snobs that ran India were getting passages to and from the UK, and the soldiers that had been out there defending India were being held back. And they had families, and they had sweethearts that they loved, and they wanted to go back to them. And that was actually the expression he used with the general. He said, look, we love the same as you do. And if your class goes home, so does ours. It was great. They had the army over a barrel in the same way as the ones at Kantara did. The army knew they had to give way, because if they didn't, it's quite simple, you go and tell the local press. And then see what happens to counterinsurgency. What would happen? There would be an absolute eruption. They actually used as a bargaining lever, not so much the niceties of trades union negotiation in terms of skill, or even the use of force, but the anticipation of what would happen in terms of civil contingencies against an uprising, a local uprising. It was, as it were, turning imperialism upon its head. Although I must say, most of the soldiers were as patriotic as could be. Don't look for red flags, there are very, very few of those. Very, very few. Most waved the Union Jack. But then, if you're trying to impress the public and the media, that's what you would do. That's my lot.
Chairs for the last to talk, but I'll take over 2 brief questions. Anyone would like a brief question? No.
Yeah. I was going to ask, you mentioned women and their mutinies and how they put down very
Yeah.
Is that just why was that? Was that just a case of lack of bargaining position for them, or what?
It's usually because you don't get large groups together. What you have is a very strict system of control on a barracks basis. But you've got to have a common area to meet. A lot of the women who are working, for example, in hospitals or in the signals department, or working as carpenters, women who put in a whole range of occupation, tended to be employed in small packets, as it were, a few hundred at any given time. And they were always under guard. They were always kind of, as it were, protected. They say they're protected, but if you look at the number of pregnancy cases that came back to the UK through Sherborne, if you ever look at the records, then you see P cases. That's what they are. They're the when we go back. So the protection wasn't 100%, but it's simply that. There is a woman called Rose McKenna, an Irish woman. She later wrote a pamphlet under the pen name Libertia. She lived in Dublin, but I almost know more about her. But she was deported because she was very Republican in her views, and she was shipped out from Calais. Again, I know very, very little about her. I did have somewhere a reference to the person who ordered her to be shipped out under guard, but not much more than that. The women did also support, by the way, the Railway Operating Division at Calais when they went on strike as well. They came out in support of them. So it does happen. But the women were, in many cases, the army shifted out almost as fast as they were from the munitions factories. Yeah, it's a different dynamic. In Bristol, what you have is women who are being pushed into domestic service, actually demonstrating here for the right not to have to wear a pinny and a mob hat. It's one of the demands of the domestic servants movement here. But it's a totally different area. We'll address it on another occasion.
One more question. Quick question.
Yeah.
Back.
You talked about situations where there are mutinies going on in parallel with kind of local insurgencies or local kind of nationalist uprisings,
yeah,
and how that was used as an indirect lever or threat.
Yeah.
Were there ever any instances where there was direct cooperation or collaboration between those? Or not really?
Briefly, no. There is, but the only one I can think of right off the top of my head is the 1920 Connaught Rangers mutiny, where it was alleged that the Irish Republican soldiers who mutinied in India were said to have referred to local Indians saying, "You've got troubles of your own." But I'm dubious about it. The rank and file of that particular formation, although politically animated by developments in Ireland, were also engaged in that counterinsurgency work and went around burning down villages in India. Read Frank Richardson's book called Soldier Sahib. It's in quite a lot of libraries, and you get a very vivid impression of what rank and file soldiers thought of the Indians. Slightly above dogs, I think.